Welcome to another deep dive, everyone. This time we're going to be taking a look at a pretty thorny issue, to be honest.
That's interesting.
It is. We're diving into how we remember public figures, especially those who've been accused of, well, sexual misconduct. And all of this in the age of hashtag Me Too. It gets
Right.
complicated.
Yeah, that's a heavy one for sure. A lot of layers to unpack there.
Definitely. And to help me unpack all of this, I've got an expert with me. Welcome to the deep dive.
Thanks for having me. It's a timely conversation for sure.
It really is. I mean, just think about some of the names that came up in the research. Kirk Douglas, Kobe Bryant, even Sean Connery, we're going to be talking about him too.
Wow. Yeah. Big names, big legacies, and big controversies too.
Exactly. And of course, we can't forget about Natalie Wood. I mean, the circumstances surrounding her death are still, well, they're still pretty mysterious.
Oh, yeah, definitely. That case is definitely a reminder of how complicated these things can be. I mean, it's been decades, and people
Mm.
are still trying to figure out what really happened.
So true. And this deep dive kind of boils down to a few key questions, like how do we deal with posthumous reputations? What about the ethics of disclosure, especially when someone's gone? And what role does social media even play in shaping how we remember someone? It's a lot.
It really is. You've given us a lot to think about today.
We have. So let's jump right in, shall we? One of the first things that jumped out at me in the research was this whole concept of the show some respect dilemma.
Show some respect.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That old saying, don't speak ill of the dead. It makes you think, though, right? Like, how does that hold up when we're talking about really serious accusations? Especially when we're talking about things like sexual violence.
Right, right. It definitely brings up some conflicting feelings there. Because on one hand, there's that traditional notion of respect for the deceased.
Right, like common decency.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But then there's the issue of accountability too. If someone did something wrong, do we just sweep it under the rug because they're no longer with us?
That's the dilemma, isn't it? And the research actually points out that historically, journalism has often defaulted to silence in these situations, especially in things like obituaries. It's almost like there's this unspoken rule to just focus on the positive and avoid the messy stuff.
It's true. And the research even uses this phrase, like it says, in journalistic forms of public remembrance, silence concerning the bad deeds of the deceased translates as discretion, honoring the memory of the dead, and giving families and effectively attached fans time and space to work through their grief.
Wow, that's a mouthful, but I get it. Like, you don't want to kick people when they're down,
Right.
especially when they're grieving.
Right. But then again, that silence can also be seen as protecting the accused, can it? Like, if we don't talk about these things, are we really getting the full picture?
Exactly. And that's where the hashtag #MeToo movement comes in. It really has challenged this, I think, this culture of silence, hasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, hashtag Me Too has really forced us to confront the systems that have allowed harassment and abuse to go unchecked for so long. It's not just about individual bad actors anymore. It's about shining a light on the enablers and the power structures that make those behaviors possible.
It's like hashtag #MeToo went from whispers to, well, to a roar, really. And it demanded accountability.
It did. And part of that accountability, I think, has been about shifting how we see sexual violence itself.
Yeah. In what way?
Well, hashtag Me Too really reframed it. It went from being seen as this rare, almost monstrous act to something much more commonplace. And I think that's one of the reasons it resonated with so many people.
Wow. Yeah, when you put it like that, it really makes you think. Like, it wasn't just a few bad apples, it was a whole system.
Right. And that was such a powerful message. I mean, think about that Chilean feminist anthem, El violador en tu camino. The rapist is you.
Oh, wow, yeah. That chant went, like, completely viral, didn't it? All over the world.
It did. It really captured that shift in thinking.
Yeah.
It wasn't just about individual monsters anymore. It was about pointing a finger at the pervasiveness of the problem, the systems that allowed it to flourish, and even the role of bystanders.
Yeah. It makes you think, though, right? Like, is calling every man a potential rapist really the answer? I mean, that's pretty provocative, right?
Oh, it was definitely provocative. And it sparked a lot of debate. Some people felt like it was an oversimplification of a complex issue. Like
Mhm.
it kind of reinforced these traditional gender roles, even though that wasn't the intention. But it definitely got people talking.
That's for sure. It's a good point, though. Like, nuance is important. We've got to be careful not to just paint everything with a broad brush.
Absolutely.
And speaking of broad brushes, the research talks about this tendency to label people, especially in these high-profile cases, as monsters. Like, we're quick to slap that label on figures like Harvey Weinstein or Bill Cosby or R. Kelly. But is that really helpful?
It's tempting, right? Because it kind of makes us feel better, I think. Like, if we can label them as monsters, then we can distance ourselves from them. We can say,
Yeah.
well, we're not like that.
Right, right. Like, they're the monsters, so we must be okay.
Exactly. But the problem with that kind of thinking is that it decontextualizes everything, you know?
Yeah.
It prevents us from looking at the systems and the environments that allowed these behaviors to happen in the first place.
Yeah, it lets everyone else off the hook too easily. Like, if it's all about these few monsters, then the rest of us are fine, right? We don't have to examine our own roles or the systems we're a part of.
Right. And the research makes a really good point about this. It says that um, operating as a tool of decontextualization, the label of monster exceptionalizes the accused and others them as separate and distinct from their colleagues, the habits within their work environments, and even the fabric of society in general.
It's a good point. We're all part of this fabric, aren't we? We can't just separate ourselves from the problem that easily. It reminds me of another thing that came up in the research, this whole idea of networked sleuthing.
Oh, yeah. That's a fascinating one. It's like this whole world of amateur detectives using the internet to investigate cases, sometimes even solving them. It's like a mix of citizen journalism and, well, true crime, I guess.
It is. It's pretty amazing what people can uncover online these days. I mean, think about groups like Bellingcat. They've used publicly available information to expose some serious stuff, like war crimes and government corruption.
That's right. And then there are those more like pop culture examples, like that documentary, Don't Fleck with Cats.
Oh, yeah, yeah, I remember that one. Crazy story. Internet users basically tracked down this guy who was, like, torturing animals online.
Exactly. It really shows the power of like collective action online, how people can come together to do some pretty incredible detective work.
It's pretty powerful. But there's a dark side to all of this too, isn't there? I mean, I remember that whole thing with the Boston Marathon bombing. Internet sleuths actually misidentified someone as the bomber.
Oh, right. And that turned out to be completely wrong. It really shows the danger of this mob mentality that can sometimes take over online. You know, how quickly people can jump to conclusions without really having all the facts.
It's a good reminder that we have to be careful, right? Just because something's online doesn't mean it's true. And I think that brings us to another tricky issue, which is the whole shitty media men list.
Oh, right. That was a wild one.
It was. It started as this like private spreadsheet, right? A way for women in media to warn each other about, well, about men who had a reputation for harassment or abuse.
Right. But then it went public, didn't it? And it
Yeah.
became this whole big controversy.
Yeah. I mean, on one hand, it felt empowering, like women finally had a platform to speak out and hold these guys accountable. But on the other hand, there were a lot of questions about due process, like were these accusations vetted? What about the men who were wrongly accused? It was a messy situation for sure.
It was. And the research even highlights how that whole situation kind of backfired in some ways because it fed into this narrative that #MeToo was all about gossip and rumor mongering.
Hmm.
There's this quote that says, the association of #MeToo with gossip seems to be a very effective strategy in seeking to discredit its aims.
Right. It's like people are saying, oh, this is just a bunch of women gossiping.
Exactly. And it really minimized the very real issue of sexual harassment and assault.
It's like they were saying, don't take it seriously.
Yeah. And that's the danger, I think. It's so easy to dismiss something as just gossip when it's convenient, you know. But historically, gossip has often been a way for marginalized groups to share information and expose those in power, haven't it? Like, think about how many times we've heard about powerful men getting away with things for years because people were afraid to speak up publicly.
Right. They were whispering in private, but no one wanted to be the one to go on the record.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So there's definitely a gray area here. It's not always easy to figure out, like, what's legitimate and what's just, rumor.
It's a good point. It's like in the age of social media, where information spreads so quickly, we have to be even more careful about what we believe and what we share. And that brings us to, well, to one of those cases that's been shrouded in rumors for years, the Natalie Wood case. I mean, there have been whispers about Kirk Douglas's involvement in her death for decades.
Oh, right. Those rumors have been swirling around for a long time.
Yeah.
And they really took off online, didn't they?
Yeah, they did. It all started with this blog post back in 2012, and then it really reignited during the 2018 Golden Globes when they honored Douglas. Social media just exploded with speculation.
It did. It was like everyone suddenly became an armchair detective. It's amazing how quickly things can spread online.
It is. But for a long time, it was all just speculation, you know? No one was really willing to go on the record. But then Natalie's sister, Lana Wood, she finally broke the silence. In her memoir, she publicly accused Douglas of assaulting Natalie.
Wow. So after all these years, someone finally came forward with a direct accusation. I bet that was a huge moment.
It was, and her words are just heartbreaking. She writes, with no one still around to protect, I'm sure she'll forgive me for finally breaking that promise.
It really speaks to how power imbalances can silence victims, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And how it can take years, even decades, for them to feel safe enough to share their stories.
It does, and even then, there's no guarantee of justice or closure, is there? It's a long and difficult road.
It is.
And then, of course, there's the Kobe Bryant case. I mean, his death in 2020 was just tragic. And it unleashed this outpouring of grief from, well, from people all over the world.
It did. It was like the whole world stopped for a moment.
It really was. But his death also brought the sexual assault allegations against him back into the spotlight. It was a real moment of reckoning, I think.
It was. I mean, how do you reconcile the grief of losing this iconic figure with the very real harm he may have caused? It's a question a lot of people are grappling with.
Right. Like, can we separate the art from the artist? Can we celebrate his accomplishments on the court while acknowledging the accusations against him off the court? It's tough.
It's definitely tough, and I think that's what makes these conversations so important.
It's about trying to find that balance, isn't it?
It is.
And it's not easy, especially when you bring social media into the mix. Do you remember what happened when Felicia Sonmez, that reporter for the Washington Post, tweeted a link to an article detailing the allegations against Bryant?
Oh, yeah. It was right after his death, right?
Oh, yeah. And she was just bombarded with hate online. Threats, insults, people calling for her to be fired. It was brutal.
It was. And I think it really highlighted how raw those emotions were, how some people just weren't ready to have that conversation yet. They wanted to grieve without having to confront that part of his legacy.
And it wasn't just online harassment, right? I mean, her own employer, the Washington Post, actually suspended her for being ill-timed, if I remember correctly.
They did. It really shows you how much pressure there was to just, maintain this image of Bryant as a hero,
Mm.
and how anyone who dared to challenge that narrative was basically punished.
It's like it was okay to grieve, but it wasn't okay to talk about anything that might complicate that grief.
Right. And that's a problem, isn't it? I mean, how can we have honest conversations about these complex issues if we're not even allowed to bring them up?
That's the question, isn't it? Like, how do we find a way to honor someone's memory while also acknowledging the harm they may have caused?
Exactly. And that's something we're going to keep unpacking as we delve further into these ideas. It's about finding a way to hold both of those things in our minds at the same time.
It's about, like, embracing the complexity, I guess.
Exactly.
And it's not always comfortable.
It's not, but it's necessary.
Yeah.
Not. But it's necessary if we want to have any hope of moving forward.
Right, because ultimately, this isn't just about the past, is it? It's about the future, too.
You hit the nail on the head. The way we remember the past shapes how we see the present and how we imagine the future. It's all connected.
It really is. And I think that's what the research is getting at, isn't it? Like, it's calling for a more nuanced approach to remembrance, right? One that goes beyond just, like, good guy, bad guy judgments.
Absolutely. It's about moving beyond what the research calls prescriptive morality. Does that term resonate with you at all?
Prescriptive morality. Not really. It sounds a bit academic, to be honest, like something out of a philosophy textbook.
Oh yeah, I get that. It's basically about having this fixed set of rules for judging what's right and wrong. Like a checklist of virtues and vices. This is good, this is bad, case closed, no room for nuance.
Ah, okay. Yeah, now I get it. It's like that black and white thinking we often see. He's a hero, she's a villain. End of story. No room for, like, the gray areas of life.
Exactly. But the research argues that this kind of thinking, it's too simplistic, It doesn't capture the complexity of human experience.
Right. We're all more than just the sum of our good deeds and bad deeds. And the research actually advocates for a shift away from this kind of prescriptive morality towards something they call ethics.
Yes. And they describe ethics as a process of interrogation, which sounds Bit intense, maybe.
It does, but I think I'm starting to see the distinction here. Like with prescriptive morality, it's all about judgment, right? Like labeling someone as good or bad based on a set of predetermined rules.
Right. It's about fitting people into neat little boxes.
Yeah. But with ethics, it sounds like it's more about understanding. Like instead of just slapping a label on someone, we take the time to consider all the factors involved, to ask questions, to try to understand the why behind someone's actions.
Getting it. It's about engaging with the messiness, with the ambiguity. It's about recognizing that things aren't always black and white.
So, applying this idea of ethics to, say, the Kirk Douglas case,
Mm.
it wouldn't just be about debating whether he was a good or bad man. It would be about looking at the power dynamics of Hollywood in the 1950s. You know, the studio system, the star culture, the way women were treated. It was a different world back then.
It was, and those factors, they're crucial to understanding how someone like Douglas might have been able to get away with the alleged assault. And it's not about making excuses, right? But it's about recognizing the context in which those actions occurred. It's about asking, like, how do those power dynamics affect our understanding of the situation?
Right. It's like trying to understand a fish by taking it out of water.
Right.
You need to see it in its environment to really get it.
Exactly. And I think this applies to remembering someone like Kobe Bryant, too. I mean, his death really divided people, didn't it?
Oh yeah, big time.
You had those who saw him as a hero, a legend, and then others who felt it was really important to acknowledge the sexual assault allegations against him. It's a really tough conversation to have.
It was. And the research actually uses Bryant's death as a case study, like for how celebrity remembrance can spark these really vital discussions about sexual violence. It talks about how social media kind of amplified both the grief and the debate. It's like everyone had a platform to share their thoughts and feelings, which can be both good and bad, I guess.
Definitely. And it brought to light this challenge of navigating those seemingly opposing viewpoints, right? Like,
Yeah.
how do we hold space for both the grief and the need for accountability?
Yeah.
How do we reconcile those two things?
Especially after what happened with Felicia Sonmez, that reporter who tweeted about the allegations. The backlash she faced was, well, it was intense. I mean, people were calling for her to be fired, sending her death threats. It was scary.
Oh yeah, that was a real low point in like internet culture, I think. And it just shows how difficult it is to have these conversations, especially when they involve someone who is so beloved.
Hmm.
But it also highlights the question, right? Like, can we truly honor someone's legacy without acknowledging the harm they may have caused?
Right. It's a big question. And I think the research points us towards some key principles for navigating these kinds of situations. One of them is this idea of capacious remembrance. Does that sound
Oh,
familiar?
yeah. Capacious remembered.
Yeah.
It's all about recognizing that people can be, well, they can be complex, can't they?
They can be, and contradictory even. Like they can be capable of great things and terrible things. And our understanding of them, our memory of them, it should reflect that. It shouldn't be about trying to force people into these neat categories of, good or bad.
Exactly. It's about embracing the messiness of human nature, recognizing that we're all a mix of light and shadow.
So it's okay to have like mixed feelings about someone, to admire their work while also condemning their harmful actions. Like we don't have to choose one or the other.
You don't. It's
Yeah.
actually a sign of maturity, I think, to be able to hold those two things in your mind at the same time.
It's about seeing the full picture, isn't it? Not just the parts we like.
Yes. And it's also about recognizing that our memories, they're not static. They change and evolve over time.
Yeah.
As we learn new information, as our own perspectives change, the way we remember someone can shift too.
So it's okay for our understanding of someone to change, to evolve as we do.
Absolutely. That's how it should be, I think. We should always be open to new information and be willing to revise our understanding as needed. It's not about erasing the past or rewriting history. It's about engaging with it in a way that's both critical and compassionate.
It's like we're always learning, right? And as we learn, we grow, and our memories grow with us. So capacious remembrance is one principle the research highlights. Another one is the importance of context, which we talked about earlier with Kirk Douglas and, the whole Hollywood system. What kind of context do we need to consider with someone like Kobe Bryant?
Well, with Bryant, one crucial aspect is how society views athletes, particularly black male athletes. There are a lot of stereotypes and assumptions at play. The research actually quotes the sports scholar A. Lamont Williams, who talks about the burden of prevailing historical discourses of black sexual aggression. It's a lot to unpack, for sure.
It is, but I think what you're getting at is that Bryant's case wasn't just about him as an individual, right? It was about how race and gender intercept in our culture, how those historical narratives come into play and shape how we perceive certain actions.
Exactly. And those factors, they add layers of complexity to how we remember him. It's not just about separating the art from the artist. It's about understanding the context in which that art was created.
Right. It's like we can't just isolate these issues from their social and historical context. It's all connected. So we've talked about capacious remembrance and context. Are there any other key principles we should keep in mind when navigating these complex issues of remembrance?
One more. Yeah, it's a big one. Centering the experiences of victims. I think that's crucial.
Oh, absolutely. It's so easy to get caught up in the debate about the accused person's legacy that we forget about the harm that was done. We forget about the people who are hurt. We need to make space for those voices.
Yes, 100%. The research actually talks about how remembrance should also include acknowledging the victims and their stories. It even quotes a survivor who puts it beautifully. They say, the ability to hold multiple truths about anyone, whether it be a celebrity or someone we were personally connected to, is an act of love and respect to be able to see a person for all of who they were.
Wow. That's really powerful. It's a reminder that there are multiple perspectives to consider and that honoring someone's memory doesn't mean silencing those who were hurt by them.
Exactly. It's about acknowledging the full spectrum of their impact,
Yeah.
both the positive and the negative. And it's about making sure that the voices of those who were harmed are heard. It really is. It's about holding space for all of it, the good, the bad, the messy. And I think we have to acknowledge how social media plays into all of this too, right?
Oh, absolutely. It feels like social media has just completely transformed the way we remember, hasn't it? Like everything is amplified online, the good, the bad, the speculation, the judgment. It can be a bit overwhelming, to be honest.
It can. The research calls this networked remembrance. And it's fascinating to see how it both like challenges and reinforces those traditional ways we remember people. Like on one hand, you see voices amplified that might have been totally silenced in the past.
Right, like victims of abuse, marginalized communities,
Yeah.
people who maybe didn't have a platform before.
Exactly. But then on the other hand, there's this rush to judgment online, this quickness to condemn or defend without really knowing all the facts. It could be a bit of a double-edged sword, I think.
It is. Like everyone has a megaphone now, right? But sometimes that megaphone amplifies the wrong things, and it makes it hard to separate like what's real from what's just noise.
It does. I mean, think about the Kirk Douglas and Natalie Wood case.
Hmm.
Those rumors were swirling online for years before Lana Wood's book even came out.
Oh, yeah, for
Yeah.
sure. Like so much of what was being said online was just pure speculation.
Right. And the research actually talks about how network sleuthing, while it can be effective sometimes, it can also really blur the lines between fact and fiction. Like that game of telephone.
Mm.
The message gets distorted along the way. And we have to be so careful not to mistake like speculation for actual evidence.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's on each of us, right? To be discerning about what we consume and share online, especially when it comes to sensitive topics like this.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We have a responsibility to be critical thinkers.
We do. So how do we even navigate this new landscape of remembrance, you know? How do we separate the signal from the noise? How do we engage in these conversations thoughtfully and responsibly? It's like a minefield out there.
It can feel that way.
Yeah.
But I think a good place to start is by cultivating a healthy dose of skepticism.
Hmm.
Like, don't just blindly accept everything you read online. Question your sources, consider different perspectives, and be comfortable admitting when you just don't know something.
Right. Like not everything is black and white. That's
Exactly.
it's about being an active participant in shaping these narratives, right?
Yeah.
Not just passively consuming whatever pops up on our feed. It's about taking ownership of how we remember.
That's such a good point. It's about being intentional.
It is, and it's also about recognizing that remembrance is an ongoing process, right? Like our understanding of individuals and events can evolve as new information emerges and as societal norms change. Like
Right.
what might have seemed clear-cut 10 years ago might look totally different today.
Oh, for sure. Think about like how our understanding of consent has evolved. What might have been considered acceptable behavior in the past is now seen as completely inappropriate.
Exactly. So it's about staying open to new information,
Right.
and being willing to revise our understanding.
Absolutely. It's not about erasing the past or rewriting history. It's about engaging with it in a way that's both critical and compassionate.
I love that. Critical and compassion. Those are like the key ingredients, aren't they?
They are.
And you mentioned earlier that remembrance is ultimately about shaping the kind of future we want to create. And that really resonated with me. It's like how we choose to remember, it can actually influence the path we take going forward.
It's true. I mean, the stories we tell about the past, the way we choose to remember, they have a direct impact on how we understand the present and how we envision the future. It's like we're looking back to inform our path forward, you know?
It's powerful stuff. Like we can use remembrance as a tool for positive change.
We can. And that's why it's so important to engage in these conversations honestly and hopefully. We need to acknowledge the harm that was done, but we also need to believe in the possibility of redemption and progress. Otherwise, it's easy to just get stuck in a cycle of negativity.
Oh, I love that. Accountability without losing sight of the potential for positive change. It's a message that feels, I don't know, it feels especially relevant right now, you know?
Yeah.
In the age of hashtag Me Too, where there are so many stories of abuse and injustice coming to light, it can feel really overwhelming.
It can be. But we can't let it paralyze us.
Hmm.
We have to use that awareness, that knowledge, to fuel positive action, to work towards a world where these things happen less and
It's
less.
about turning remembrance into a catalyst for change, isn't it?
Yes, exactly. It's about honoring the past while also working towards a more just and equitable future.
This has been quite a journey, hasn't it? We've covered a lot of ground, explored some really challenging topics.
We have. But it's been so insightful, too.
It has. And I think we've uncovered some really valuable insights about how to navigate the complexities of remembrance in a way that feels, I don't know, in a way that feels both ethical and
I
meaningful.
agree. It's about finding that balance.
It is. And so as we wrap up, I just want to leave our listeners with one final thought. The way you choose to remember, it's a reflection of your values. It's a statement about what you believe is important and what kind of world you want to live in.
That's a powerful way to put it.
So be intentional, right? Be intentional about the stories you tell, the legacies you uphold, the lessons you carry forward, and strive to remember in a way that honors the truth, respects the victims, and inspires you to create a more just and compassionate world. It's a journey we're all on together.
Beautifully said. Remembrance is not a passive act. It's a choice. And that choice, well, it has the power to shape not only your own life, but also our collective future.